we're meeting at a time when the Middle East is going through a moment of profound historical change. Now, you're probably used to speakers speaking on this subject, saying something like that at the outset of their remarks. Well, we meet at a time of great crisis and a time of great whatnot. The fact of the matter is, quite genuinely now, the Middle East is at the cusp of a process of immense change. Borders which had seemed to be permanent between states are fading into irrelevance. New political forces are on the rise. There are those, and I'm one among them, who consider that this may indeed constitute the greatest moment of change in the region, indeed since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the conclusion of World War I. That is to say, since the moment of the birth of the modern Middle East in a political context. And in this talk, what I want to try to do is to look at the current balance of forces in the region deriving from this process of change. It's important, first of all, as a kind of caveat, to note that the region remains in flux. We're in the middle of a process of change. We're not yet at the end of it. So any assessment of the current state of affairs shouldn't be seen as a suggestion that the present lines or the present situation will be permanent. I'm seeking here to identify the trends that have dominated recent developments and to draw some preliminary conclusions as to who is currently arrayed against who. And I want, of course, also to consider the implications of the current state of affairs for Israel. First of all, then, in looking at the Middle East, where we are right now in 2014, it's important to have a sense of the strategic map of the region at the moment prior to the wave of change that began to sweep the Middle East in early 2011. That wave of change, of course, misnamed by the global media as the Arab Spring. In the period prior to 2011, in the decade or so prior to 2011, the Middle East was dominated by a sort of Cold War system in which the United States-led dispensation, which had held sway since the end of the Cold War against the Soviet Union, as I say, since 1989-1990, was being challenged by a new, smaller and more cohesive alliance dominated by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran's allies and clients included the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah-dominated Lebanon, the government of Iraq, the Hamas and Islamic Jihad movements among the Palestinians, the Sudanese regime of Omar al-Bashir, and a number of other elements. The United States-led dispensation, meanwhile, rested on a number of core foundations, with the American friendships with Egypt, with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with Israel, of course, and also in a more problematic way with Turkey, central among these foundations. Iran portrayed and portrays on an ideological level its push for regional hegemony as an alliance of authentic Muslim powers united against the declining sunset power of the West. This is the terminology that the Iranians enjoy using. The declining sunset power of the West and its local hirelings. In practical terms, and this is vital for us to note, given our primary concern with Israel, in practical terms, the Iranian target, the primary Iranian target, was and remains control of the Persian Gulf area. This is the region, of course, so vital to global energy supplies, and hence to the global economy, and hence to the exercise of power in the Middle East. The Iranians understand well, as we should all understand, that real power in the Middle East is won and lost in the Gulf. The Gulf possesses an estimated oil reserve of 565 billion barrels. This accounts for more than 63% of the world's total known oil reserves. The Persian Gulf also possesses 30% of the world's proven natural gas reserves, second only to the supplies available in Russia. As a result of this riches, this treasure available then in the Persian Gulf, it is a primary goal of Iran to tempt or intimidate the other countries of the Gulf into a defense alliance and cooperation with Tehran. But the Iranians are concerned not only with the Gulf. They're concerned with the Mediterranean, with reaching the Mediterranean too. There is a clearly visible Iranian ambition to establish access to the Mediterranean Sea through the establishment of a contiguous line of pro-Iranian regimes between the Iraq-Iran border and the Mediterranean Sea. Those of you, and I'm sure there are some in our audience today who are students of history of the Middle East in antiquity, will know that this Iranian desire to reach the Mediterranean is a desire going all the way back to antiquity. The Persians have been trying to reach the Mediterranean for thousands of years, and this is what we're currently experiencing as kind of the modern manifestation of a very long-standing goal. Now, in strictly geostrategic terms, Israel ought not to have been a central element in any of this. That is to say, in historic terms, once again, there's no great historic accounting between the Jewish people and the Persian people. Indeed, once again, in terms of antiquity, going back into history, unusually in the Jewish experience, the record with the Iranians is largely on the credit side. It was, of course, the Persians rather, it was rather on the credit side, going back to King Cyrus, permitted the Jews to rebuild the temple, of course, the Beit HaMikdash, and so on and so forth. And yet, for both ideological and pragmatic reasons on the part of the Iranians, Israel has found itself front and center of Iranian attention in recent years, hostile attention in recent years. Pragmatically speaking, the Iranian regime has been acutely aware throughout of the central problem inherent in its bid for leadership of the region. And it is that the Iranians, as Shia Muslims and as non-Arabs, are essentially strangers, if not foes, historic foes, in the Arab and almost an overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim Middle East. The Iranians clearly hoped and hope that by making themselves the militant champions of the Palestinian cause, by grabbing the banner, so to speak, of the Palestinian cause, which remains the central cause célèbre of pan-Arabism and of Sunni Arab populations, by grabbing this banner, they can turn it into an endless generator of legitimacy for their own cause. The result of this in practical terms has been that Israel has found itself on the receiving end of much rhetorical and indeed practical attention from the Iranians, such that on the eve of the events of 2011, the two remaining active fronts of Arab-Israeli conflict, namely Hezbollah-controlled southern Lebanon to Israel's north and Hamas-controlled Gaza to the southwest, both consisted of local Islamist insurgencies, genuine local Islamist insurgencies, whose war effort was nevertheless made possible only by the presence of massive Iranian support and involvement, both in financial terms and in terms of weapons provision and in terms of expertise. Thus far, the bad news from an Israeli point of view, so to speak, in terms of the architecture of the region on the cusp of the Arab Spring. Now, there is a credit side to this story too, because the acquisition of new enemies can also bring with it the acquisition of new friends, on the basis that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And indeed, what Israel found in the years preceding the Arab Spring, the years of Iranian hostility, which continues to this day, of course, but in a deeply changed region, was that it was able to build closer relations with other countries who were also threatened by Iran, including countries with which it had and has no formal diplomatic relationship. And I'm thinking primarily of the oil-rich Arab countries of the Gulf, and most importantly, although not only, but most importantly, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And in addition to that, we should remember the strong relationship built up with Mubarak's Egypt on the basis of Mubarak's opposition to Iran in the years prior to the Arab Spring, and also with the United Arab Emirates, with Kuwait, and with a number of other players. So, into this not simple strategic picture, into this not simple strategic architecture, erupt in the course of 2011 and 2012 a series of uprisings and revolutions and civil wars, as we said before, collectively misnamed, so to speak, by the global media under the term of the Arab Spring, and later on renamed, at least by some Israeli commentators, as the Islamic Winter or Arab Winter or Arab Autumn, or one loses track after a while, but we know what we're talking about, so which is the most important thing. The result of this process, as we shall see and as I shall go on to try to outline, has been to bring into being a new strategic picture, which I want to focus on. But to put it in a nutshell at the beginning, so to speak, of this part of the talk, I want to say the following. The Iran-led alliance still exists, of course. Its ambitions and goals still exist, but it is a diminished and weakened affair as a result of the events of recent years. With regard to the other alliance, the pro-American alliance, which the Iranians were seeking to challenge and replace, there is, and I wish to state this very strongly and categorically, there is no longer a coherent pro-US alliance in the region. The pro-US alliance in the region has been the victim both of the events of the last 3 years and no less so of the nature of the American response to the events of the last 3 years. There is no longer a coherent pro-US alliance in the region, but what there is that many of the former members of the pro-American alliance have come together into a new Sunni alliance, as we shall see, gathered around an axis running between Cairo and the Saudi capital of Riyadh. Other powerful forces exist in the region now outside of either of these groups. I'm going to go on to look at them. But let's first of all look at how this process played itself out. As the Arab Spring began, and as regimes began to be threatened by popular uprisings or to fall to popular uprisings, those of us who do this stuff for a living, or who do Middle East analysis for a living, began to ask ourselves the immediate question as to whether there was some commonality between the regimes which were falling to popular unrest. And as we looked at the first regimes to fall, remember Ben Ali in Tunisia was the first, followed then by Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, we noticed that there was an emerging pattern, which was that the kind of regimes that appeared to be falling were all Arab regimes of a particular type. They were all Arab regimes of the type patented by, if you remember, Colonel Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt in the early 1950s, who created the first of these kind of regimes. These were Arab regimes of the secular, military, nationalist, dictatorial type. And for a moment in the Middle East, as the Arab Spring got going, it looked like history was delivering its verdict on that type of regime, and that it was departing the stage of history. It's interesting, however, to note that the first couple of regimes to fall, Ben Ali and Mubarak, were both pro-Western Arab regimes. In fact, let me state this yet more strongly in the following terms. Ben Ali was the leader of an important, stable, so it seemed, but relatively peripheral country on the edge of the Arab world in North Africa. And Hosni Mubarak in Egypt was the leader of the absolute central anchor and linchpin of the pro-American arrangement in the region in general, and indeed of Israel's security in the region in particular. Which meant that for a while, there was a moment in mid-2011 when the pro-Iranian side of the line in the Middle East thought they were going to have the pleasant experience of sitting back with arms folded and watching their enemies rip themselves apart. And there is a fascinating document to that brief moment of optimism on the part of the pro-Iranian camp, which is an interview given by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad on January 30th, 2011, to the Wall Street newspaper in the United States, in which Bashar goes into great detail with a certain amount of pomposity, I think it's fair to say, as to why Syria had not been affected by the Arab Spring, and as to why Syria would not be affected by the Arab Spring. And Bashar goes into great detail as to how the Syrian regime may appear to be dictatorial to the crude Western eye, but in actual fact sort of myriad networks of communication exist between the people and the regime, such that such crude measures of public opinion as free elections or free media are not necessary, because they know somehow what the people want and what the people need. It's great stuff. You can look it up. It's still available for free on the internet, and it's particularly good because, of course, a month and a half after this interview by Bashar al-Assad about how there was not going to be an Arab Spring in Syria, there were a series of demonstrations in Daraa province in the south of the country. The regime tried to drown those demonstrations in its own blood. The demonstrations spread. The demonstrators began to arm themselves, such that by summer of 2011, Syria was in a state of full-fledged civil war, and it was apparent to all of us, as professional Middle East analysts, so to speak, that the wave of change sweeping the region was not going to stop at the walls where the Iran-led alliance began. Rather, it was going to take in both pro-American regimes, such as Mubarak and Bin Ali, but also pro-Iranian regimes. As I said, however, on both the pro-American side and on the pro-Iranian side, it was regimes of a particular type of governance that were being affected. It was the officers' regimes, it was the nationalist regimes, which led us then as analysts to ask ourselves the inevitable next question, which was if the regimes that were falling or being threatened all had something in common, and it appeared that they did the forces emerging to replace them similarly share something in common? And the answer clearly was yes. In context after context and in country after country, the forces rising to replace the crumbling regimes represented one or another form of Sunni political Islam, but most overwhelmingly movements associated with the International Muslim Brotherhood organization. And the result was that countries that were associated with support for the Muslim Brotherhood were deeply energized, so to speak, by the developments that were taking place and were instrumental in aiding and supporting the forces on the ground. Most important among these countries, the Emirate of Qatar and the Republic of Turkey, both in very different ways pro-Muslim Brotherhood states who were looking forward, they thought, to increase regional influence through involvement with an emergent Muslim Brotherhood regional bloc, a new regional bloc, which would of course include the most populous Arab country, Egypt. The brothers were in power in Egypt after the elections in the course of 2012, and they expected would also soon include Syria, when the regime looked like it was teetering on its last legs, Tunisia. They hoped also among the Palestinians that Hamas would come to dominate, and so on and so forth. That then, at the end of 2012, a year and a half into the Arab Spring, was how the situation looked. The pro-US bloc, or former pro-US bloc, was in disarray. Egypt had been lost to the Muslim Brothers. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was furious and frightened at what it regarded as an American failure to adequately back US allies. And we remember, people will remember the Peninsula Shield intervention into Bahrain in mid-2011. You may remember this. It's seen as something of a footnote. It's very important. The Saudis and the Gulfis got together in mid-2011 to put down a rebellion in Bahrain. Now, it's not every day, as you will know, that the Saudis get up in the morning to put in a day's work. So if they are doing that, it means that something very strange is going on. And in mid-2011, something very strange was going on. The Saudis were terrified as they realized that the people they had traditionally relied on to look after them in times of trouble, namely the United States of America, were absent, and they were going to have to do it for themselves. And so they did. This is a measure of the extent to which confidence had been lost in the United States by former United States allies, and indeed by willing US allies who wanted to carry on being US allies, but who found no structure to identify with. Thus far then, with regard to the first moment of the Arab Spring, it looked like the Muslim Brothers at the end of 2012 were on the rise. It looked like there was going to be a new Sunni power bloc in the region. And from Israel's point of view, this portended potential disaster. because, of course, as we are aware, Israel's regional strategic situation, but also the growth of the Israeli economy over the last 30 years and the subsequent opening up and maturing of Israeli society, all the good stuff, there's been plenty of good stuff that's taken place in Israel over the last 30 years, ultimately is dependent on, and is understood to be dependent on, the successful maintenance of the peace treaty with Egypt, with the largest single Arab power and the most formidable former adversary. And quite genuinely, in 2012, we were looking at the realistic prospect of that peace agreement being gradually drained of all content, and of the real possibility of a return to hostilities in the living future, not immediately, not within 6 months, but in the living future between Israel and Egypt. And of course, this process in the course of 2013 was reversed and was set back. The Muslim Brotherhood and Sunni Islamism have suffered a series of setbacks in the course of 2013, leaving them in disarray and much reducing their regional presence. But first and foremost, the historic military coup that took place in Egypt on July 3rd, 2013 was the moment at which the advance of Sunni Islamism across the region, apparently a tide of history as many people saw it, was stopped. And it was stopped by concerted and determined action on the part of the Egyptian military, who sent the Muslim Brotherhood leaders back to jail, and who restored order on the streets, and who, by the way, vitally importantly, began immediately, or recommenced immediately, the security cooperation with Israel in northern Sinai, which continued and continues to this day. This is first and foremost. But secondly, the reversal of events in Syria was an additional setback to the Muslim Brothers and their friends. The recovery of the regime's forces, the regime's fortunes, with the assistance, of course, of the Iranians and of Hezbollah. And also on the rebel side, the increasing strength of Salafi and Al-Qaeda elements, more extreme Sunni Islamist elements among the rebels. All of these then have served not to remove the Turkey-Qatar Muslim Brotherhood bloc, but to reduce it to its natural dimensions and vastly decrease its importance. But no less importantly, perhaps more importantly, the July coup in Egypt has given birth to a new and potent Sunni alliance centered on Cairo and Riyadh. Cairo and Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And it's fascinating to note that the Saudi, I'm not somebody who goes in for conspiracy theories, but it is fascinating to note that the Saudis, within 24 hours of the Sisi coup, were the first country in the world to recognize Sisi as the legitimate government of Egypt and to pledge $10 billion in support of it. As to whether we will discover in the archives, probably not, because Arab archives are never open, but as to whether we would find in the archives, should they ever be opened, that the Sisi coup was a Saudi-aided production from the very start, I have no idea. But certainly within 24 hours of it taking place, the Saudis and the UAE were on board with financial pledges. This then was a new alliance which included those forces, with Egypt and Saudi Arabia chief among them, who felt threatened both by the advance of the Muslim Brotherhood and by the ambitions of the Iranians, who of course had not gone away through any of this process. So this new alliance included and includes the Saudis, the Egyptians, but also Jordan, also the United Arab Emirates, also Kuwait, and interestingly and fascinatingly, as a kind of adjunct, unstated member, the State of Israel. No less interestingly, as an additional junior member of this alliance, is the Ramallah Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas. It doesn't mean that we're going to get to make peace with them anytime soon, but it's an odd situation. Abbas is a friend of General Sisi, and so are we. It's a curious situation. This chaos, this regional chaos of the last 3 years, and the result of the removal of the autocratic regime in Iraq in 2003 and the subsequent departure in 2011 of US forces from that country, and the contraction of the regime in Syria, and the birth of the Muslim Brotherhood alliance, which I mentioned, and the birth of the Cairo-Riyadh alliance, which we've discussed, and the continued, if reduced, existence of the Iran-led regional bloc together then have served to create something resembling a perfect storm in our Middle East region. And it is finding its most active or extreme expression in the massive cross-border sectarian war currently stretching from the Iraq-Iran border all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, taking in the countries formerly known as, so to speak, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. How to explain this? Why has this chaos come to replace the sclerotic but stable order of the Arab dictatorships that has largely been swept away in the course of the last 3 years? What are the factors that have brought chaos rather than hope, that have brought civil war rather than new forms of political order in the region? I think it's important to remember that the states of Iraq and Syria, and other Arab countries too, never succeeded in creating a real sense of citizenship or loyalty or identity in the multi-ethnic and multi-sectarian areas that they governed. Rather, what they succeeded in doing was to crush with a very firm hand any authentic political expression among the peoples over whom they ruled. The result was then, once those authorities were removed, or at least were set back, political formations based on the pre-existing loyalties of those populations, overwhelmingly ethnic or religious or sectarian in nature, are naturally now re-emerging. This is a process which began in Syria as the Sunni Arab population and the Kurds developed independent fighting organizations, and the region and sought to gather, and the regime rather sought to gather minorities around itself. But this process has not been contained to Syria, where it began in 2011. In the course of this year, it has erupted into Iraq, with the growing Sunni unrest from early 2014, the slipping of border areas outside of government control, and then of course the ISIS offensive into Iraq in June and then again in August 2014. And this process of collapse has erupted also now in the course of this year into Lebanon, with the ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra foray into Arsal in the Bekaa Valley in April 2014, and the subsequent attempts to build links between the Sunni rebels in Syria and the Sunnis of Lebanon. It's taking place also in Yemen, where Shia Islamists supported by Iran are now in effective control of the Yemeni capital. So as I said, as a result of the breakdown of powerful centralized regimes and the ambitions of Iran, and the desire of the Saudis to contain those ambitions, and the growth and proliferation of ethnic and sectarian political and military organizations among both Sunni and Shia, the Middle East is now rent by a sectarian war stretching from Lebanon down to Yemen, taking in Iraq, Syria, to a lesser extent Bahrain, and also eastern Saudi Arabia. The Shia side in this war remains united, and I began this lecture with speaking about the Iran-led regional alliance. The Iranians are still there, and it's the Iranians who are gathering around them the Shia forces. The Sunnis, on the other hand, are divided. There's the Saudi-supported elements, there's the Qatar, Turkey, Muslim Brotherhood people, and of course there are independent, very extreme jihadi groups, such as the Islamic State, most famous but not alone among them, which also maintain relations among themselves or make war among themselves and have their own complex and often hidden relations with Sunni states. Thus then has the region been transformed. The US is no longer a central player in any of this, because the US has elected not to be a player in any of this. This is important to be clear on. If the Americans are not there in the Middle East on the ground or in force in political terms anymore, it's not because anybody's forced them out. It's not because the Americans don't have an economy anymore that can support that kind of involvement. They surely do, and they have a growing economy, one of the fastest growing economies in the Western world again today. It is because the Americans have chosen to adopt a strategy which precludes effective involvement. It's a strategy that appears to be to seek rapprochement with the Iranians, to maintain good relations with the Sunnis, except for the very, very extreme among them, and to seek to bridge between all forces, Sunni and Shia, except for the most extreme, the ISIS and the Al-Qaeda. This is unlikely to work, but more importantly, it is probably also even almost irrelevant to the current direction and the current shape of events. Lastly and finally, what does all this mean for Israel? First of all, it's crucial to understand that we as Israelis are neighbours to this process. Close neighbours, unfortunately. What can we do? That's where our country happens to be. Close neighbours to it, but we are not partners to it. What do I mean by that? What I mean is the following. Ultimately, and on the deepest level, what all this story is about, of Arab collapse and war and uprising, is the profound failure of the Arab state in the post-colonial context to successfully develop economies, to successfully develop societies, to successfully develop political systems. Now, we have many problems in our country, but we are not partners to that failure. We are not a failed state. Our army certainly works. Even our political system, after a fashion, remains in function. Our society certainly works. Our economy certainly works. We are not a failed state. Which means that the task facing Israel on the most primary level, as a result of all this, is one which is easy to state, but harder to achieve. And it is the task of effectively fencing ourselves off, so to speak, from the chaos all around us, enabling the flourishing of our own society to exist, even in the unfortunate proximity to utter chaos and hostility in which we find ourselves. Now, on the most basic level, that comes down to issues of hard security. It's about building fences, it's about surveillance, it's about investing intelligently in the creation of intelligence gathering material, in the creation of new military units that will be deployed on the border. It's also about diplomacy. It's about preserving and developing the very good relations which we have, first and foremostly with the Sisi regime in Egypt, but also with the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And it's important to stress this, I'm sure everybody here follows the news closely, in spite of King Abdullah's silly and populist statements made in recent days with regard to the supposed desecration of the Haram al-Sharif and other disgusting terms of Jews on the Temple Mount. King Abdullah understands behind the scenes very well just how vital to him, no less than to us, the very deep security and intelligence relationship that his kingdom has with Israel, and the foundations of that are not in danger in spite of his populist expressions. So on a secondary level, the diplomatic element of developing and keeping those relations with Egypt, with Jordan, even where possible with the Ramallah Palestinian Authority, is also a key element of this, it would seem to me. At the same time, the nature of the Palestinian polity and the weakness and the hostility continued of Palestinian polity, not only Hamas, but also Fatah, means that in the context of this regional chaos, it is highly unlikely that Israel is going to be able to be in a situation in the immediate future where it will be able to envisage the possibility of withdrawing, of major withdrawals in the West Bank, which would be likely to lead to the presence of this regional chaos instead of held there on the Jordan Valley all the way up to Netanya and to the ridges overlooking the airport. This is not going to be possible, and this is something which I think is going to be part of the reality we're facing. And finally, in terms of the tasks facing Israel in responding to this emergent reality, I would say on the deepest level, the issue is one facing Israeli society itself. And here I don't want to speak in cliches or a rhetorical sense, but rather to speak about reality. It's an easy thing to say, well, and in addition to all this, we need to be strong, we need to carry on fighting, and so on and so forth. We do need to do all that, and we will do it. But it's not a simple thing. To maintain the existence of a healthy, successful, Western-style economy in which people actually want to live and actually want to raise their children, next door to the absolute chaos and bloodshed of the current day Middle East, is not a simple thing. And ultimately, it's a thing that comes down to values and to faith at the deepest level. Faith in the justice of our cause, faith in the nature of our society, faith in the institutions that underlie it at its most basic level. And it will be the task, I think, of this generation of Israelis now coming up, so to speak, to continue to educate themselves and to educate their children in the rightness of that way, given the reality, because the reality is not an easy one. The reality, and on this I will conclude, is that there is a historic process underway in the Middle East. We know how it started. We're currently in the midst of it. We don't know yet how it's going to end. It is one which has consumed and is consuming a large number of human lives, largely, thankfully, not Jewish and Israeli lives as of now, but lives of the neighbours. But up to 250,000 people dead in Syria in the course of the last 3 years, an unprecedented bloodletting taking place in their neighbourhood. We know it started, we're in the midst of it, we don't know how it's going to end. It may well not yet have reached its height. And on that happy note, I'll be quiet and happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.